Protesters took to 3 different institutions on this tax day to push for a different use of their tax dollars, advocating to divest ties to the war in Gaza. 12 News' Dana Curran attended the traveling protests to learn more.
Protesters around the southern tier voiced their dissent at Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, and Binghamton University for each institution's alleged ties to the ongoing war in Gaza. A letter was hand-delivered to each company to demand a different use of their taxpayer funds.
We all have blood on our hands, just as taxpayers. And I think our chief orientation towards the Palestinians and towards this so-called conflict is as those American citizens, as the funders and financiers of this war.
Binghamton resident Caleb Deshaw was among the protesters that followed the route from Owego to Endicott to Vestal on Tuesday. He believes any potential change cannot happen without organization like this.
Currently, we have almost no say in what goes on. The government tells us what we can and can't do. They tell us what's going to happen, and we just have to follow it. We don't have to accept that. If we come together and have our voices heard, we can make change within our society.
Jacob Wisnock was one of several Binghamton students on hand for the morning's events. He says recent efforts by the federal government to limit pro-Palestinian speech on college campuses has not stopped his urgency to speak out.
I feel like more compelled to exercise my birthright, my civil rights, my constitutional liberties, and speak up for the voice of the oppressed around the world.
In statements provided to 12 News on Tuesday, Binghamton University said in part, quote, "We remain committed to upholding the principles of free speech, academic freedom, and peaceful protest. However, these freedoms come with responsibilities. Protests must be conducted in a manner that does not threaten the safety, operations, or well-being of our campus community." A spokesperson with Lockheed Martin said, quote, "We respect the right to peaceful protest and remain focused on supporting the U.S. government and its allies to deliver strategic deterrence and security solutions." 12 News reached out to BAE Systems but did not get a response. Daniel Curran, 12 News, Broome County.